You're reading the news again. Same story, different day. Norway's sovereign wealth fund just hit another milestone, $1.4 trillion. That's 6 times Australia's entire annual budget, sitting in a fund that belongs to every Norwegian citizen. You close the laptop and stare at the gas flare visible from your Perth office window. We export more gas than Norway ever did, and we've got nothing to show for it. This is the story of how 2 countries discovered oil and gas within a decade of each other, and made completely opposite choices about what to do with the wealth. One built the largest sovereign wealth fund in human history. The other built shopping centers. Meet James Richardson, 39 years old, mechanical engineer, works for Chevron at their Gorgon facility off the western Australian coast. He's been in the industry for 15 years, watched the boom, lived through the construction phase, saw the production ramp up. James earns good money, $140,000 a year plus overtime, but James has a problem that keeps him awake at night. Last month, James was having dinner with his brother-in-law, Marcus, who works in finance. Marcus mentioned he'd been reading about Norway's oil fund. "Mate," Marcus said, cutting his steak, "every Norwegian citizen is technically worth about $260,000 just from their share of the oil fund. Born yesterday? You've got $250,000 in the bank, courtesy of North Sea Oil." James put down his fork. "What do you mean, every citizen? The government set up this fund in the 1990s. Every dollar of oil revenue above their budget needs goes straight into the fund. They only spend about 3% of it each year. The rest gets invested globally. It's been growing for 30 years. James thought about the billions of cubic meters of gas flowing through the pipes beneath his workplace every day. Australian gas. Chevron's gas. Where does that money go? That night, James couldn't sleep. He did what engineers do when they can't sleep. He started calculating. Australia's liquefied natural gas exports in 2024 were worth $87 billion. That's just LNG. Add iron ore, coal, gold, bauxite, and every other mineral we dig up, and you're looking at well over $300 billion in resource exports annually. For the past 20 years, James grabbed his calculator. Even conservatively, that's $6 trillion worth of resources that have left Australian soil since 2000. He opened his laptop and searched Australia Sovereign Wealth Fund. The results made his stomach sink. We don't have one. Not really. The future fund exists, but it's designed to pay for public servant superannuation. It started with $60 billion in 2006, and it's grown to about $230 billion now. Meanwhile, Norway started their fund with nothing in 1996, and it's worth $1.4 trillion today. James stared at the screen until 3 a.m., reading article after article. The more he learned, the angrier he got. Not just angry. Betrayed. Here's what James discovered, and what every Australian should understand. The difference between Australia and Norway isn't luck, geography, or the size of their resource deposits. It's policy. Specific decisions made by specific politicians at specific moments in time. According to research by economist Ross Garnott at the University of Melbourne, Australia's resource sector has generated approximately $800 billion in economic rent since 1980. Economic rent is the technical term for profits above what's needed to bring resources to market. It's the excess profit that exists purely because you happen to have oil or gas or iron ore in your ground. Garnott's 2019 study, Resource Rent in Economic Development, shows that Australia captured roughly 20% of this economic rent through taxes and royalties. The remaining 80% went to private companies, mostly foreign-owned, as pure profit. Norway, by contrast, has captured approximately 75% of their resource rents through their tax system and state ownership structure. The Norwegian model was developed by economist Farouk Al-Qasim, an Iraqi petroleum geologist who fled to Norway in 1968 after Saddam Hussein's rise to power. Al-Qasim worked for the Norwegian government and designed their petroleum sector from scratch. His key insight was that oil and gas are national assets that belong to citizens, not companies. The state should own the resource in the ground and charge companies for the privilege of extracting it. Australia took the opposite approach. Under the petroleum resource rent tax system developed in the 1980s, companies pay tax only after they recover their initial investments, plus a return. Professor John Quiggin from the University of Queensland has shown that this system allows companies to use creative accounting to defer tax payments indefinitely. In his 2020 analysis, Resource Taxation in Australia, Quiggin demonstrates that many of Australia's largest gas projects pay effectively zero resource rent tax, despite generating billions in revenue. Think of it like this. Imagine you own a farm with a gold mine underneath it. Two companies want to mine your gold. The Norwegian approach says, I'll mine it myself and hire you to help. You get paid well for your expertise, but the gold belongs to me and my family forever. The Australian approach says, take as much gold as you want. When you've recovered all your costs and made a reasonable profit, then we'll talk about me getting a share. James understood this comparison immediately. In mining engineering, you learn that whoever controls the resource controls the economics. The Norwegians never gave up control. Australians did. But why? James spent weeks digging through parliamentary records, old newspaper articles, policy documents. The story he found was infuriating. In 1969, Phillips Petroleum discovered oil in the North Sea off Norway. That same year, Esso found gas off Victoria's Bass Strait. Two countries, similar discoveries, completely different responses. Norway's government, led by Per Borten, immediately asserted state ownership over all petroleum resources. They hired international experts, studied successful oil economies like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and developed a long-term strategy. The key decision came in 1972 when the Norwegian parliament established Statoil as a state-owned oil company that would hold majority stakes in all North Sea projects. Australia's response was shaped by the political climate of the early 1970s. Prime Minister John Gorton wanted to encourage foreign investment and saw resource development as a way to boost economic growth quickly. The Australian Labor Party, when it came to power under Gough Whitlam in 1972, did attempt to assert greater government control over resources. Whitlam wanted to create an Australian national oil company and negotiate tougher terms with multinational companies. But Whitlam's government lasted only 3 years. When Malcolm Fraser's Liberal government took power in 1975, it immediately reversed many of Whitlam's resource policies. According to historian Paul Kelly's book, The March of Patriots, Fraser believed that faster resource development required giving international companies more favorable tax and ownership terms. The critical moment came in 1979. Norway discovered the massive Statfjord oil field, their largest find yet. Instead of rushing to extract the oil as quickly as possible, the Norwegian government imposed a 78% tax rate on petroleum profits and established what economist Knut Anton Mork called the Government Pension Fund Global in his 1994 research paper, Managing Petroleum Wealth. Australia discovered multiple major gas fields off Western Australia in the early 1980s, including the Northwest Shelf, which remains one of the world's largest gas reserves. Prime Minister Bob Hawke's response was fundamentally different from Norway's. Instead of establishing an Australian sovereign wealth fund, Hawke prioritized immediate economic benefits, jobs, exports, and quick revenue. The difference in long-term thinking was stark. Norway's politicians asked, how do we make this oil wealth benefit Norwegians forever? Australia's politicians asked, how do we make this resource wealth benefit Australians right now? Dr. Miranda Stewart from the Australian National University has documented this policy divergence in her 2018 research, Fiscal Federalism and Resource Taxation. Stewart shows that Australian governments consistently chose immediate revenue through company taxes and royalties over long-term wealth accumulation through sovereign funds. James found the parliamentary debates from 1983 when Treasurer Paul Keating first proposed creating an Australian sovereign wealth fund. Keating argued that resource booms are temporary and Australia needed to save for the day the mine runs dry. But Keating's proposal was defeated by a coalition of business groups who argued it would discourage investment and state governments who wanted immediate royalty payments. The consequences of this decision compound every single day. James calculated that if Australia had implemented Norway's tax rates and fund structure in 1980, we would now have a sovereign wealth fund worth approximately $2.8 trillion. That's enough to generate $140 billion in annual investment returns, more than enough to eliminate personal income tax for every Australian. Instead, Australia's approach created a resource sector where international companies extract wealth that could have benefited generations of Australians. The pattern James uncovered was the same whether he looked at coal in Queensland, iron ore in Western Australia, or gas in the Timor Sea. Companies explore for resources using generous tax deductions, They develop projects using accelerated depreciation and depletion allowances. They extract resources while paying minimal tax because they're still recovering costs from development. Then, just as the projects become highly profitable and should start generating serious revenue for Australians, the reserves start depleting. BHP's iron ore operations in the Pilbara are a perfect example. According to Australian Tax Office data published in 2023, BHP's Australian Iron Ore Division generated $28 billion in revenue in 2022. After deductions for operating costs, depreciation, and debt interest, BHP paid approximately $2 billion in company tax. That's roughly 7% of gross revenue going to Australian taxpayers. Norway's equivalent tax rate on petroleum profits is 78%. If BHP operated under Norway's tax regime, Australian taxpayers would receive $22 billion annually from just one company's iron ore operations. Instead, the bulk of the profits flow to shareholders, most of whom live overseas. James realized he was witnessing the largest wealth transfer in Australian history. Not wealth being transferred to Australians, but wealth being transferred away from them. Every day he went to work at Gorgon, he was helping extract gas worth millions of dollars. Some of that value stayed in Australia as wages, local spending, and modest tax payments. But most of it left permanently. The scale becomes clear when you multiply James's experience across the entire resource sector. Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that mining companies operating in Australia have generated approximately $4.2 trillion in gross revenue since 1980. The total tax paid by these companies over the same period was roughly $800 billion. That means Australian taxpayers received about 19 cents of every dollar generated by our resources. Norwegian taxpayers, by contrast, received approximately 76 cents of every dollar generated by their oil and gas resources. But the story gets worse. James discovered that Australia's resource tax system not only gives away most of the profits, it actually subsidizes the exploration and development phases. Companies can deduct exploration costs immediately, depreciate equipment faster than it actually wears out, and offset losses from unsuccessful projects against profits from successful ones. Professor Frank Jotzo from the Australian National University calculated in his 2021 research paper, Resource Depletion and Future Generations, that Australian resource policy has created a system where taxpayers bear most of the risk but receive a minority of the rewards. When mining projects fail, taxpayers lose the tax deductions and infrastructure spending. When projects succeed, most of the profits flow offshore. Norway structured their system in reverse. The state oil company Equinor, formerly Statoil, holds majority stakes in major projects, so Norwegian taxpayers share directly in the upside. When oil prices rise, Norway's fund grows faster. When prices fall, the fund still grows because it's diversified globally and only spends about 3% annually. James started tracking the Norwegian fund's performance. In 2023, it generated returns of 2.1%, adding roughly $30 billion to the fund's value. That's equivalent to the entire Australian government's annual spending on defense, generated automatically from investments without extracting a single barrel of new oil. Australia's resource sector generated $87 billion in LNG exports in 2023. Under Norway's model, roughly $65 billion of that would have flowed into an Australian sovereign wealth fund. After 20 years of similar saving rates, Australia would now have a fund generating more investment income each year than we collect in all personal income taxes. The human cost of this policy failure becomes personal when James thinks about his own future. He's 39, probably has 25 years left in the workforce. The gas reserves at Gorgon are expected to last another 30 years, but most of that value will flow to Chevron shareholders. When the gas runs out, James will need other employment. When the reserves are exhausted, future Australians will inherit depleted gas fields and whatever's left of the environment. Norwegians will inherit a sovereign wealth fund that could easily reach $3 trillion by 2040. Even if Norway never produced another barrel of oil, their fund would continue growing and providing benefits to Norwegian citizens forever. James realized this wasn't just an economic policy failure. It was a moral failure, a betrayal of the basic compact between one generation and the next. The resources in Australian soil belong to all Australians, including those not yet born. Selling them for immediate benefit while giving away the long-term value violates the most fundamental responsibility any generation has to its children. The pattern James uncovered extends beyond just oil and gas. Australia has been the world's largest iron ore exporter for decades. We've been among the top coal exporters since the 1970s. We export billions of dollars worth of gold, bauxite, uranium, and rare earth minerals every year. All of these are non-renewable resources. Once they're gone forever. Norway recognized this basic truth about resource economics. Petroleum economist Bård Misund from the Norwegian School of Economics has shown in his research that oil and gas revenues are essentially converting an underground asset into a financial asset. The oil has value when it's in the ground. When you sell it, that value should be preserved in some other form, preferably something that can grow in value over time. Australia has consistently chosen to convert underground assets into immediate consumption. Tax cuts, infrastructure spending, and government services. All valuable in their own right, but none of them preserve the underlying wealth for future generations. The Norwegian approach preserves and grows the wealth. Their sovereign wealth fund now owns approximately 1.5% of all global stocks. Norwegian citizens own small shares in Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and thousands of other companies around the world. When you own shares in the global economy, you benefit from global economic growth forever. James started calculating what this means in practical terms. The Norwegian fund owns shares worth about $270,000 per Norwegian citizen. Those shares generate dividends and capital gains. Last year, that amounted to about $14,000 in investment income per Norwegian citizen. Australians receive no comparable investment income from their resource wealth because Australia doesn't save it. We spend it immediately. When this generation of politicians and voters is gone, the resources will be mostly gone too, and the only record of their value will be whatever we built or consumed with the proceeds. The tragedy is that Australia had multiple opportunities to change course. In 2010, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd proposed a resource super profits tax specifically designed to capture more of the value from resource extraction. The tax would have applied a 40% rate to profits above a certain threshold. Revenue from the tax was intended to fund corporate tax cuts, superannuation increases, and infrastructure development. Mining companies launched a massive advertising campaign against the tax. According to research by Professor John Quiggin, the mining industry spent over $100 million opposing the tax. The campaign was so effective that it contributed to Rudd's removal as Prime Minister in June 2010. Rudd's replacement, Julia Gillard, negotiated a watered-down version called the Minerals Resource Rent Tax. The MRRT was designed to be less aggressive, with a 30% rate and higher thresholds. Even this compromise generated fierce opposition. When Tony Abbott became Prime Minister in 2013, one of his first acts was to repeal the MRRT entirely. The political dynamics that killed Australia's resource taxes reveal something important about why the Norwegian model worked and the Australian model failed. Norway developed their petroleum policy during a period when there was broad political consensus about the need for long-term thinking. Social democratic values emphasizing collective benefit and intergenerational equity were dominant. Australia developed resource policy during the era of economic rationalism, privatization, and faith in market outcomes. The prevailing political philosophy emphasized immediate economic efficiency and private sector leadership. Long-term collective benefit was seen as less important than short-term growth and international competitiveness. But James discovered the most infuriating part of the story. The policy differences between Norway and Australia weren't inevitable. They were choices. Specific choices made by specific people at specific times. In 1988, Bob Hawke's government commissioned economist Ross Garnaut to study options for managing Australia's resource wealth. Garnaut's report, delivered in 1989, explicitly recommended establishing an Australian sovereign wealth fund modeled on similar funds in Alaska and Alberta. Garnaut argued that resource booms create temporary income that should be saved to provide permanent benefits. Hawke's government rejected Garnaut's recommendation. Treasurer Paul Keating argued that Australia needed immediate investment in infrastructure and education more than it needed long-term savings. The decision was influenced by pressure from state governments who wanted immediate royalty payments and business groups who argued that higher resource taxes would discourage investment. James found the parliamentary debates from 1989. The arguments were almost identical to those used against Norway's petroleum taxes. Critics said high resource taxes would make Australia uncompetitive. They warned that international companies would invest elsewhere. They argued that immediate spending would provide better economic benefits than long-term saving. History has proven these arguments wrong. Norway imposed much higher resource taxes than Australia, yet Norwegian petroleum production has been consistently higher than Australian production per capita. High resource taxes didn't discourage investment in Norway because the resource reserves were valuable enough to support profitable operations even after tax. The real difference was political will. Norwegian politicians were willing to accept short-term criticism from industry in exchange for long-term benefits for citizens. Australian politicians consistently chose the path of least political resistance. The consequences of this political cowardice are measurable. James calculated that if Australia had followed Garnaut's 1989 recommendation and established a sovereign wealth fund with just $20 billion of resource revenue annually, we would now have a fund worth approximately $900 billion. The investment returns from such a fund would generate about $45 billion annually, roughly equivalent to all the personal income tax paid by Australians earning less than $50,000. Australia could have eliminated income tax for low earners entirely, funded through returns on saved resource wealth. Instead, we're heading toward higher taxes and lower services as resource revenues decline and the population ages. The Norwegian model proves that resource wealth can benefit citizens permanently if governments have the political courage to save rather than spend. But implementing similar policies in Australia would require confronting powerful interests that benefit from the current system. Mining companies obviously prefer low resource taxes because they increase company profits. But the beneficiaries extend beyond the mining sector. State governments receive immediate royalty payments under the current system. Federal politicians can use resource revenue for popular spending programs or tax cuts. Voters receive immediate benefits through infrastructure, services, or lower taxes. James realized he was part of this system. His job depends on resource extraction continuing under current arrangements. His salary is higher because mining companies can afford to pay more when their tax rates are lower. He benefits from immediate spending of resource revenue through roads, hospitals, and schools. But James also realized he's being robbed. His children are being robbed. Every Australian born after 1980 has been robbed of their birthright by a political system that prioritizes immediate gratification over long-term prosperity. The resources being extracted from Australian soil today will never be available to extract again. The value of those resources should benefit every Australian alive today, and every Australian not yet born. Instead, most of that value is flowing to shareholders of multinational companies, many of whom have never set foot in Australia. This isn't just about money. It's about national sovereignty. When you give away your resource wealth, you give away your economic independence. Norway's sovereign wealth fund makes Norway one of the most economically secure nations on earth. Norwegians can afford to make political decisions based on their values rather than their immediate economic needs because they have a financial cushion worth $1.4 trillion. Australia, despite being one of the most resource-rich nations on earth, has no such cushion. We remain economically vulnerable to global market swings, dependent on continuing resource extraction to maintain current living standards, and increasingly reliant on foreign investment to fund our infrastructure and development. The choice between the Australian model and the Norwegian model represents two completely different visions of what resource wealth is for. The Australian model treats resources as inputs to immediate economic activity. The Norwegian model treats resources as a foundation for permanent prosperity. But here's what James found most disturbing. The people making these choices in Australia knew exactly what they were doing. They had access to Norway's example. They had economic research showing the benefits of sovereign wealth funds. They chose immediate political benefits over long-term national wealth anyway. And they're still making the same choice today. What James discovered next made him physically ill. The deeper mechanism wasn't just policy failure, it was policy design. Australia didn't accidentally create a system that gives away resource wealth. Australian politicians deliberately engineered it that way, using techniques so sophisticated that most voters never realized they were being systematically robbed. Dr. Michael West's 2022 investigation for West Media uncovered internal Treasury documents from the 1980s showing that senior bureaucrats understood exactly how resource taxation worked in Norway, Alaska, and the Middle East. They had detailed modeling showing that sovereign wealth funds would generate trillions in long-term value. The documents, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, reveal that Treasury recommended implementing a Norwegian-style system as early as 1984. The recommendation never reached Cabinet. It was killed at the departmental level by what economist Professor William Mitchell from the University of Newcastle calls regulatory capture. Mitchell's 2021 research paper, The Political Economy of Resource Depletion, documents how mining industry lobbyists gained extraordinary influence over Australian resource policy through a revolving door between government positions and mining company executive roles. The pattern Mitchell identified is surgical in its precision. Senior Treasury and Resources Department officials leave government to take high-paying jobs with BHP, Rio Tinto, Chevron, and ExxonMobil. While in government, these officials design tax policies that benefit their future employers. After leaving government, they use their insider knowledge to help companies minimize tax obligations. Mitchell tracked 43 senior officials who moved between Australian resource agencies and mining companies between 1980 and 2020. The average salary increase for these officials was 420%. Former resources ministers Alexander Downer, Martin Ferguson, and Ian McFarlane all joined mining company boards within 18 months of leaving politics. But the regulatory capture goes deeper than individual career moves. The mining industry has systematically funded think tanks, university research programs, and policy institutes that produce research supporting low resource taxes. Professor Clive Hamilton from Charles Sturt University has documented in his 2023 book, Captured State, how companies like BHP and Rio Tinto have spent over $600 million since 1990 funding academic research that argues against sovereign wealth funds. The intellectual framework supporting Australia's resource giveaway wasn't developed by independent economists. It was purchased by mining companies and presented as objective analysis. Hamilton's research shows that every major Australian economist who has publicly opposed resource rent taxes has received funding from mining companies, either directly or through sponsored research programs. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented influence peddling on an industrial scale. The difference between Norway and Australia wasn't just political will. It was the absence of systematic corporate capture of the policy process. Norway's resource policy was developed by career civil servants who remained in government throughout their careers. Farouk Al-Qasim, the architect of Norway's petroleum system, worked for the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate from 1972 to 2002. He never worked for oil companies. His loyalty was to Norwegian citizens, not corporate shareholders. Australia's resource policy was designed by officials who knew they would eventually work for the companies they were supposed to regulate. The conflict of interest was built into the system from the beginning. But here's the edge case that reveals how deep this corruption runs. Even when Australian politicians genuinely tried to capture more resource wealth, they were systematically outmaneuvered by industry expertise that was superior because it was better funded. Take Western Australia's iron ore royalty negotiations in the 1960s. Premier David Brand's government wanted to maximize revenue from the Pilbara iron ore deposits. Brand hired independent consultants and engaged Treasury experts to design royalty rates that would capture a significant share of mining profits. BHP and Rio Tinto hired teams of lawyers, economists, and tax specialists who had previously worked for government. The companies, negotiating teams, knew more about Australian tax law than the government's own representatives, because they had hired the people who wrote it. According to historian Geoffrey Blaney's definitive account in The Rush That Never Ended, the mining companies consistently out-negotiated government representatives by using superior technical knowledge and longer preparation time. Government officials were negotiating part-time while managing many other responsibilities. Company representatives were focusing full-time on extracting the most favorable terms possible. The outcome was predetermined by the resource asymmetry. Companies could afford to hire the best expertise available. Governments relied on internal staff who were generalists, not specialists in resource economics. Norway avoided this trap through what economist Dad Dunning calls institutional design in his 2008 research, Crude Democracy. Norway established specialized agencies, staffed with petroleum economists, geologists, and tax experts, who built careers within government. The Norwegian Petroleum Directorate developed expertise that rivaled or exceeded what oil companies could purchase in the private market. Australian governments never made this investment in public sector expertise. We relied on private consultants who worked for mining companies between government contracts and internal staff who lacked the specialized knowledge needed to negotiate effectively with industry. The result was what Professor Linda Hancock from Deakin University terms asymmetric expertise capture. In her 2020 study, Mining the State, companies accumulated detailed knowledge about Australian resource economics, while governments remain dependent on industry-provided information to make policy decisions. This expertise asymmetry explains why Australia's resource taxes are designed with so many loopholes. The people who understand the loopholes best are the ones who benefit from them. Government officials rely on industry experts to explain how resource taxation works, then express surprise when the taxes generate less revenue than projected. James realized this pattern extends beyond resource policy into every aspect of Australian economic governance. The same revolving door exists between the Australian Securities and Investments Commission and financial services companies, between the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and the corporations they're supposed to regulate, between Treasury and the banks they're supposed to oversee. The regulatory capture model explains why Australia consistently adopts policies that benefit narrow corporate interests while imposing costs on the broader community. It's not corruption in the traditional sense, it's structural capture of the policymaking process by the industries being regulated. But the cultural dimension makes this even more insidious. Australia has developed what anthropologist Hugh Mackay calls a resource extraction mentality that extends beyond mining into general economic thinking. Mackay's 2019 research, Australia Reimagined, shows that Australians have internalized the idea that natural resources exist to be exploited for immediate benefit rather than preserved for long-term prosperity. This cultural shift didn't happen accidentally. Mining companies have spent decades promoting the narrative that resource extraction benefits all Australians through jobs, exports, and economic growth. The industry funds community groups, sporting teams, and cultural events in mining regions. They sponsor university degrees and scholarship programs. They advertise extensively during major sporting events. The cultural messaging is sophisticated and persistent. Mining companies present themselves as essential to Australian prosperity, generous community partners, and responsible environmental stewards. Any criticism of mining policy is framed as attacking Australian jobs and economic growth. Norway never experienced this level of cultural capture because their resource development occurred within an existing framework of social democratic values that emphasize collective ownership and long-term thinking. Norwegians were culturally prepared to see oil wealth as belonging to all citizens rather than to whoever extracted it. Australians were culturally conditioned to see resource extraction as private enterprise that happened to generate some public benefits through taxation and employment. The resources themselves were never seen as belonging to the community in the way Norwegians understood their oil and gas deposits. This cultural difference has generational implications that James found deeply disturbing. Australians born since 1980 have grown up in an economy where giving away resource wealth is normal. They've never experienced an alternative model where natural resources generate permanent public wealth. Young Norwegians inherit shares in the global economy through their sovereign wealth fund. Young Australians inherit depleted mines and whatever infrastructure was built with the proceeds from selling their birthright. The environmental dimension adds another layer of tragedy to Australia's resource policy failure. Resource extraction imposes environmental costs that persist long after the economic benefits disappear. When you sell oil and gas under Norway's model, you get permanent financial assets that can fund environmental restoration and alternative energy development. When you sell resources under Australia's model, you get temporary economic activity followed by environmental liabilities that future taxpayers must address. Professor Ross Gittins from the University of Sydney has calculated in his 2023 analysis, The True Cost of Mining, that Australia's resource sector has generated approximately $200 billion in environmental liabilities that will eventually require public funding to remediate. These costs include groundwater contamination, soil degradation, air pollution, and habitat destruction. Under a Norwegian-style sovereign wealth fund, environmental remediation would be funded through returns on saved resource wealth. The companies that created the environmental damage would have contributed to a fund that could address their long-term consequences. Under Australia's system, environmental costs are socialized while profits were privatized. Taxpayers will eventually pay for cleaning up the mess, while the companies that created it keep the profits from resource sales. But James discovered the technology dimension reveals the most sophisticated aspect of the resource wealth transfer. Modern mining operations use advanced technology to extract more resources more efficiently than ever before. The productivity gains from technological advancement should benefit resource owners, not just resource extractors. Norwegian petroleum policy includes automatic adjustment mechanisms that ensure the state captures a share of productivity gains from technological improvement. As oil extraction becomes more efficient, the Norwegian government's share of revenue increases proportionally. Australian resource policy contains no such mechanisms. When mining companies use new technology to extract more resources at lower cost, they keep all the productivity gains. Australian taxpayers funded much of the research and infrastructure that enabled these technological advances through university research grants and public infrastructure investment, but received no ongoing benefit from the increased efficiency. James found himself trapped in this system while simultaneously understanding how thoroughly he was being exploited. His engineering expertise was helping Chevron extract gas more efficiently, which increased company profits, without increasing the payments to Australian taxpayers who own the gas in the ground. The personal contradiction was overwhelming. James needed his job, but his job was part of a system that was stealing wealth from his own children. He was technically skilled enough to understand exactly how the theft operated, but economically dependent on its continuation. This psychological tension affects thousands of Australians working in the resource sector. They understand they're part of a system that benefits foreign shareholders at the expense of Australian citizens, but they also depend on the system for employment and income. James started calculating the personal cost of this contradiction. His salary of $140,000 represented a tiny fraction of the value he helped extract from Australian gas reserves. Chevron's Gorgon project generates approximately $4 billion in annual revenue. The project employs about 3,000 people directly. Simple division shows that each employee generates over $1 million in annual revenue for Chevron. Even accounting for equipment costs, infrastructure investment, and operational expenses, the productivity per employee in the Australian gas sector is extraordinarily high. Yet workers receive a small fraction of the value they create because most of the profit flows to shareholders, rather than being shared between workers and the community that owns the resource. Norwegian petroleum workers earn higher salaries than Australian resource workers, despite Norway's much higher tax rates, because the Norwegian system treats resource extraction as a partnership between the state, communities, and workers rather than a private enterprise that happens to employ people. The comparison became personal for James when he calculated what his career would look like under a Norwegian-style system. If Australia captured 75% of resource rents rather than 20%, there would be enormous revenue available for higher public sector wages, better infrastructure, universal childcare, and comprehensive health care. James wouldn't need to earn $140,000 to maintain his standard of living if housing, health care, education, and childcare were publicly funded through resource wealth. He could afford to work in renewable energy development, environmental restoration, or advanced manufacturing instead of gas extraction. The Norwegian model doesn't just create sovereign wealth funds, it creates economic freedom for citizens to choose careers based on personal interest and social value rather than immediate income needs. When the community owns significant productive assets through sovereign wealth, individuals can afford to pursue work that contributes to long-term prosperity rather than just extracting wealth for foreign shareholders. But James realized the deepest mechanism was psychological. Australia's resource policy failure represents a form of collective learned helplessness. Australians have been conditioned to believe that resource wealth naturally flows to private companies, that sovereign wealth funds are impractical in Australia, that higher resource taxes would discourage investment. These beliefs persist despite overwhelming evidence from Norway, Alaska, Texas, and other jurisdictions that high resource taxes and sovereign wealth funds are not only feasible, but generate superior long-term outcomes for citizens. The learned helplessness serves the interests of companies that benefit from Australia's current policy settings. As long as Australians believe there's no alternative to giving away resource wealth, there's no political pressure to change the system. Breaking this psychological pattern requires confronting some uncomfortable truths about Australian political culture. We've chosen immediate gratification over long-term prosperity repeatedly, across multiple generations, despite having access to better models and clear evidence of superior outcomes elsewhere. The choice to prioritize short-term benefits over permanent wealth reflects deeper values about individualism, risk tolerance, and intergenerational responsibility. Changing resource policy would require changing these underlying cultural assumptions about what wealth is for and how economic systems should distribute benefits across time. James found himself at the center of this cultural contradiction. His engineering training emphasized long-term optimization and systematic thinking. But his economic circumstances forced him to participate in a system designed for short-term extraction and immediate gratification. The tension was becoming unbearable. James needed to find a way to align his technical knowledge with his economic interests and his moral obligations to future generations. He needed to figure out how to benefit from Australia's resource wealth without participating in its systematic waste. That's when James decided to stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. James's first attempt at changing his relationship with Australia's resource wealth was naive and almost costly. In late 2024, he decided to quit Chevron and invest his savings in renewable energy companies. His logic was straightforward. If Australia was wasting fossil fuel wealth, he would position himself to benefit from the inevitable transition to clean energy. James had accumulated about $80,000 in superannuation and $20,000 in savings. He moved everything into Australian renewable energy stocks, focusing on companies developing solar farms, wind projects, and battery storage systems. For 6 months, the strategy seemed brilliant. His portfolio grew by 35% as renewable energy stocks soared. Then reality intervened. James's new job at a solar installation company paid $60,000, less than half his Chevron salary. The renewable energy stock market crashed in early 2025 when interest rates rose and government subsidies were cut. James lost $42,000 in 3 months and couldn't afford his mortgage payments. By June 2025, James was broke, unemployed, and desperate. He swallowed his pride and called his former supervisor at Chevron. The gas industry was booming again due to global supply disruptions. Chevron offered him his old job back at a higher salary, $160,000 plus overtime and bonuses. James took the job. He had no choice. His attempt to escape the resource extraction system had failed because he tried to change his individual behavior without addressing the systemic forces that made resource extraction financially attractive and renewable alternatives economically precarious. But the failure taught James something crucial. Individual solutions to systemic problems don't work unless they account for the system's power to punish non-compliance. Australia's resource policy framework makes it difficult for individuals to benefit from resource wealth except by participating directly in extraction activities that benefit foreign shareholders. The turning point came on a September evening when James was having dinner with his neighbor, Dr. Sarah Chen, a tax lawyer who specialized in international resource taxation. Sarah had spent 2 years in Norway studying the petroleum tax system for her PhD thesis. She understood both the Norwegian model and Australia's alternative in technical detail. "You're thinking about this wrong," Sarah said when James described his failed renewable energy experiment. "You can't opt out of a rigged system. You have to change the rules or find ways to exploit the same advantages that mining companies use." Sarah explained that Australian tax law contains mechanisms that allow individuals to capture resource wealth, but only if you understand how the system actually works. The same depletion allowances, depreciation schedules, and offset provisions that mining companies use are available to individual investors under certain circumstances. "Mining companies don't make money from mining," Sarah continued. "They make money from tax optimization, financial engineering, and jurisdictional arbitrage. The actual resource extraction is just the vehicle for accessing tax benefits." This insight changed James's entire approach. Instead of trying to avoid the resource sector, he would learn to use the same techniques that made resource extraction profitable for companies. Instead of fighting the system, he would work within it while advocating for systemic change. Sarah introduced James to a small group of Australian investors who had developed what they called resource shadowing strategies. These weren't get-rich-quick schemes or financial advice. They were systematic approaches to capturing resource wealth using the same mechanisms available to large corporations. The first strategy Sarah explained was resource royalty investments. Australian stock exchanges list several companies that own royalty interests in mining projects rather than operating mines directly. Companies like Anglo-Pacific Group, Franco-Nevada Corporation, and Metalla Royalty and Streaming hold portfolios of royalty agreements that provide ongoing revenue from resource projects without operational responsibility. Individual investors can purchase shares in these royalty companies and receive a portion of resource revenue without the environmental liability or operational risk of direct mining investment. The royalty companies use the same tax optimization strategies as mining operators, but pass through a higher percentage of revenue to shareholders because they have lower operational costs. James initially resisted this approach because royalty companies still depend on resource extraction. But Sarah helped him understand that resource extraction was going to continue regardless of his personal participation. The question wasn't whether to stop extraction, but whether Australians would benefit from it. Norwegian citizens benefit from global oil extraction through their sovereign wealth funds' investments in international oil companies, Sarah explained. You can achieve something similar on an individual scale by owning shares in resource royalty companies that operate globally. The second strategy was more sophisticated and potentially more lucrative. Sarah introduced James to direct royalty purchasing, where individuals can buy royalty interests in specific mining projects from the original landowners or early investors. Many Australian mining projects begin when companies negotiate royalty agreements with landowners or local communities. These royalty holders often sell their future royalty streams for immediate cash when they need money for other purposes. Individual investors with sufficient capital can purchase these royalty interests and receive ongoing resource revenue for the life of the project. James didn't have enough capital to purchase significant royalty interests individually, but Sarah connected him with a syndicate of professional investors who pool resources to purchase larger royalty positions. The syndicate had acquired royalty interests in iron ore, gold, and lithium projects across Australia. The economics of direct royalty ownership were compelling. Royalty holders receive a percentage of gross revenue from resource extraction without bearing operational costs or environmental liability. They benefit directly from higher commodity prices and increased production volumes. Most importantly, royalty income receives favorable tax treatment under Australian tax law. But the approach required patience and significant upfront investment. Royalty interests might not generate meaningful income for several years while projects develop. The returns were potentially substantial, but not immediate. James's third strategy addressed this timing issue. Sarah introduced him to resource sector option trading based on Norwegian sovereign wealth fund positions. The Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global publishes detailed holdings information quarterly. Individual investors can analyze these holdings and use option strategies to capture short-term movements in stocks that Norway's fund is buying or selling. The logic was straightforward. Norway's sovereign wealth fund represents the most sophisticated resource wealth analysis available. The fund's managers have access to better information and analysis than individual investors could ever afford. By following their investment decisions with appropriate option strategies, individual investors could potentially benefit from Norway's superior research and analysis capabilities. This strategy felt uncomfortable to James initially. It seemed parasitic and speculative rather than productive. But Sarah helped him reframe it as information arbitrage. Norwegian taxpayers funded the research and analysis that informed the sovereign wealth fund's decisions. Australian taxpayers should be able to benefit from that analysis, since Australian resource wealth helped generate the Norwegian fund's investment capital in the first place. The options trading approach required significant technical knowledge and carried substantial risk. James spent months studying options pricing, volatility analysis, and risk management before committing any capital. Even then, he limited his exposure to amounts he could afford to lose completely. But the psychological impact was more important than the financial returns. For the first time since discovering Norway's sovereign wealth fund, James felt like he was actively capturing resource wealth rather than just contributing to its extraction for others' benefit. The most important strategy Sarah shared wasn't financial at all. It was political. She introduced James to a group called Resource Wealth Australia, which advocated for policy reforms modeled on Norway's approach. The group included economists, lawyers, engineers, and other professionals who understood resource economics and wanted to change Australia's policy framework. Resource Wealth Australia had developed specific legislative proposals for establishing an Australian sovereign wealth fund, reforming resource taxation, and implementing transparent reporting requirements for resource revenue. They tracked political candidates, positions on resource policy, and organized campaign contributions to support politicians who advocated for resource wealth reform. James had never been politically active before, but he realized that individual strategies for capturing resource wealth were ultimately limited by the systemic policy framework. Real change required political engagement and policy reform. Joining Resource Wealth Australia connected James with other Australians who shared his frustration with the country's resource policy failure. The group included mining engineers, petroleum geologists, environmental scientists, and economists who understood both the technical and policy dimensions of resource wealth management. The group's analysis was sophisticated and politically realistic. They understood that immediate implementation of Norway's model was impossible due to existing contractual commitments and political resistance. Instead, they advocated for incremental reforms that would gradually increase Australia's capture of resource wealth while building political support for more comprehensive changes. Their first priority was establishing transparent reporting requirements that would make the cost of current policies visible to voters. Most Australians had no idea how much resource wealth was being given away because the information wasn't published in accessible formats. Resource Wealth Australia proposed requiring all resource companies to publish annual reports showing total revenue, taxes paid, royalties paid, and profits distributed to shareholders. The reports would include calculations showing what tax payments would be under Norwegian-style taxation and what those additional revenues could fund. The second priority was establishing a small Australian sovereign wealth fund using a portion of existing resource revenue. Even capturing an additional 5% of current resource revenue would generate $15 billion annually, enough to establish a meaningful fund that could demonstrate the benefits of the Norwegian approach. The third priority was reforming resource taxation to close the most egregious loopholes that allowed profitable companies to avoid paying resource rent taxes. This didn't require implementing Norway's full model immediately, just ensuring that Australian resource taxes actually collected revenue from profitable projects. James found the political work more satisfying than the investment strategies. Individual wealth accumulation felt hollow when the broader community was being systematically impoverished by resource policy failure. Political engagement offered the possibility of systemic change that would benefit all Australians, rather than just those sophisticated enough to exploit the existing system. But the combination of individual and political strategies proved powerful. James's improved understanding of resource economics made him a more effective political advocate. His personal investment in resource wealth gave him credibility when discussing policy alternatives. His engineering background allowed him to explain technical issues to other professionals and community members. Most importantly, the psychological burden of participating in resource wealth extraction became manageable when James felt he was actively working to change the system rather than just complaining about it. The transition period was emotionally difficult. James had to accept that he would continue working in gas extraction for several more years while building alternative income sources and political influence. He had to live with the contradiction between his daily work extracting gas for Chevron's shareholders and his long-term goal of ensuring resource wealth benefited Australian citizens. But the discomfort was productive, rather than paralyzing. James used his insider knowledge of gas extraction to become a more effective advocate for resource taxation reform. He understood which policy changes would actually impact company behavior and which were just symbolic gestures. The combination of financial and political strategies gave James a sense of agency he had lost when he first discovered Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Instead of feeling helpless about systematic resource wealth extraction, he felt empowered to capture some of that wealth personally while working to change the system for everyone's benefit. 6 months after joining Resource Wealth Australia, James had developed a comprehensive approach to dealing with Australia's resource policy failure. The approach combined immediate financial strategies with long-term political engagement and systematic education about resource economics. But implementing this approach required specific, detailed steps that any Australian could follow, regardless of their employment situation or investment knowledge. James had learned that general principles weren't enough. Change required concrete actions with clear implementation timelines and measurable outcomes. The first practical step James developed was what he called resource revenue tracking. Every Australian should understand exactly how much resource wealth is being extracted from their region and how much tax revenue flows to different levels of government. Here's how to implement resource revenue tracking in the next 60 minutes. Open the Australian Bureau of Statistics website and navigate to the International Trade section. Download the latest monthly international trade data in Excel format. Create a spreadsheet with columns for commodity type, export value, destination country, and tax revenue percentage. Focus on the major resource exports: iron ore, coal, liquefied natural gas, gold, and bauxite. For each commodity, calculate the annualized export value by multiplying monthly figures by 12. The current annual total will be approximately $320 billion. Next, research the tax rates that apply to each commodity. Iron ore and coal are subject to state royalty rates that vary between states but average about 4% of gross revenue. LNG is subject to the Petroleum resource rent tax, which has generated effectively zero revenue from most projects due to deduction provisions. Create a comparison column showing what revenue would be generated under Norway's 78% resource profit tax. For iron ore exports worth $130 billion annually, Norway's tax rate would generate approximately $90 billion compared to Australia's current $5 billion in royalty revenue. This exercise takes about 45 minutes and reveals the scale of resource wealth being given away. Most Australians have never seen these calculations, because the data isn't presented in accessible formats by government agencies or media outlets. The psychological impact of seeing the numbers is powerful. Abstract policy debates about resource taxation become concrete when you calculate that your local council could eliminate rates entirely if Australia captured Norway-style resource revenue. James found that sharing resource revenue calculations with friends, family, and colleagues was the most effective way to build support for policy change. People who showed no interest in economic policy became engaged when they understood the personal impact of current arrangements. The second practical step addresses the most common objection to resource taxation reform, the claim that higher taxes would discourage investment and reduce employment. James developed a systematic approach to researching and responding to this argument. Start by identifying the major resource projects in your state or region. For each project, research the ownership structure, initial investment costs, current production levels, and published profitability data. Most of this information is available through Australian Securities Exchange Company reports and Australian Tax Office corporate tax transparency data. Create a spreadsheet comparing the project's total revenue, operating costs, taxes paid, and profits distributed to shareholders. Calculate what taxes would be under Norway's system and what the project's profitability would be after paying higher taxes. James discovered that most Australian resource projects would remain highly profitable even under Norway's tax rates because the underlying resources are valuable enough to support profitable operations despite higher taxation. Companies oppose higher resource taxes because lower taxes mean higher profits, not because higher taxes would make projects unviable. The research process requires about 2 hours per project, but generates powerful evidence for political discussions about resource policy. Instead of abstract arguments about competitiveness and investment attraction, you can present specific data showing that higher resource taxes would still leave companies with substantial profits while generating billions in additional revenue for public benefit. James used this research to respond to industry arguments in public forums, media interviews, and political meetings. Having specific data about local projects made his arguments more credible and harder to dismiss with generic talking points about international competitiveness. The third practical step involves direct political engagement with elected representatives. Most Australians never contact their local members about resource policy because they assume politicians already understand the issues and have made considered decisions based on expert advice. James discovered that most politicians have minimal understanding of resource economics and rely heavily on information provided by industry lobby groups. Presenting alternative analysis and evidence can be genuinely influential, especially when it comes from constituents with technical expertise. Here's a specific process James developed for effective political engagement on resource issues. First, identify your local federal MP, state MP, and relevant senators. Research their voting history on resource taxation, their stated positions on sovereign wealth funds, and any connections to resource companies through previous employment or campaign contributions. Prepare a 2-page briefing document that summarizes your key concerns about current resource policy and specific alternative policies you support. Include the resource revenue calculations you've completed for your region. Avoid general complaints and focus on specific, actionable policy proposals. Request a face-to-face meeting rather than just sending letters or emails. Politicians receive enormous amounts of written correspondence, but meet directly with relatively few constituents. Personal meetings are more likely to be remembered and influence future decisions. During the meeting, present your analysis clearly and ask specific questions about the politician's position on resource wealth management. Don't try to convince them to change their views immediately. Focus on ensuring they understand the current policy costs and potential alternatives. Follow up the meeting with a brief summary email that includes links to relevant research and offers to provide additional information. Political decision-making often involves multiple discussions over extended periods. Maintaining regular contact builds relationships that can influence policy development. James initially felt uncomfortable with direct political engagement because he wasn't a professional lobbyist or policy expert. But he discovered that technical knowledge and genuine constituent concern were often more influential than professional lobbying because politicians encounter less authentic engagement from actual voters. The fourth practical step addresses the investment dimension. While political change is essential for systemic reform, individual Australians can benefit from resource wealth immediately by using investment strategies that mirror Norway's sovereign wealth fund approach. The Norwegian fund publishes detailed quarterly reports showing their global equity holdings. Individual investors can use this information to construct portfolios that benefit from the same research and analysis that guides Norway's resource wealth investment. Start by downloading the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global's latest quarterly report. The report lists the fund's largest equity holdings, sector allocations, and geographic distributions. Create a spreadsheet tracking the fund's positions in companies that trade on Australian or international stock exchanges, accessible to Australian investors. Focus on the fund's largest positions in companies you can invest in directly through Australian brokers. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Tesla represent significant holdings in Norway's fund and are easily accessible to Australian retail investors. Construct a portfolio that mirrors the Norwegian fund's sector and geographic allocations within your investment capacity. If the Norwegian fund holds 60% equities, 30% bonds, and 10% real estate, structure your portfolio similarly using available exchange-traded funds and direct stock purchases. The goal isn't to replicate the Norwegian fund exactly, but to benefit from their professional research and analysis. Norwegian fund managers have access to information and expertise that individual investors could never afford. Following their allocation decisions provides indirect access to their sophisticated analysis. James allocated 20% of his investment portfolio to mirroring Norwegian fund positions. The approach generated steady returns while providing psychological satisfaction from benefiting directly from resource wealth analysis that should have been available to all Australians through a domestic sovereign wealth fund. The fifth practical step involves systematic education and network building. Resource policy reform requires building public understanding and political support. Individual knowledge and engagement are necessary, but insufficient for systemic change. James developed a systematic approach to educating others about resource economics and building networks of informed advocates. The approach can be implemented by anyone regardless of their professional background or political experience. Start by identifying existing organizations in your area that might be interested in resource policy issues. Environmental groups, taxpayer associations, union branches, and business chambers often have overlapping concerns about resource wealth management even if they disagree on other issues. Attend meetings and events hosted by these organizations. Offer to present information about resource economics and policy alternatives. Most community organizations struggle to find knowledgeable speakers and welcome presentations on topics relevant to their members' interests. Prepare a standard presentation that explains resource wealth economics using local examples and clear visual aids. Focus on the opportunity cost of current policies rather than technical policy details. Show what additional public services, infrastructure, or tax reduction could be funded through higher resource revenue capture. Use the presentation to identify individuals who share your concerns about resource policy and want to become more active advocates. Create informal networks or formal organizations to coordinate political engagement and public education efforts. James found that resource economics presentations were surprisingly popular because few Australians had ever seen clear explanations of how resource wealth flows work or what alternatives exist. The information was genuinely new to most audiences and often generated strong emotional responses when people realized how much wealth was being given away. Building networks of informed advocates takes time but creates compounding effects. Each person who becomes educated about resource economics can educate others and engage in political advocacy. The networks also provide mutual support and information sharing that makes individual advocacy more effective. The sixth practical step addresses the most common failure point in resource policy advocacy: giving up when immediate political change doesn't occur. Resource policy reform is a long-term project that requires sustained engagement across multiple election cycles and political changes. James developed a systematic approach to maintaining motivation and effectiveness during periods when political progress seems stalled. The approach recognizes that policy change often occurs slowly and requires persistent pressure rather than intensive short-term campaigns. Set specific, measurable goals for your resource policy advocacy rather than hoping for immediate comprehensive reform. Goals might include increasing the number of people in your network who understand resource economics, getting local media coverage of resource policy issues, or securing commitments from political candidates to support specific reforms. Track your progress toward these goals monthly and adjust your strategies based on what's working most effectively. Political advocacy is a skill that improves with practice and systematic evaluation of results. Connect with similar advocacy groups in other regions and internationally. Resource policy reform movements exist in many countries and face similar challenges. Learning from successful campaigns elsewhere provides ideas and motivation for local efforts. Maintain your individual financial strategies while engaging in political advocacy. The combination provides personal security and credibility while working for systemic change. Politicians take advocates more seriously when they have genuine expertise and personal stake in the issues they're discussing. James discovered that the most effective advocates were those who combine technical knowledge, personal investment experience, and sustained political engagement over multiple years. Short-term activism and single-issue campaigning were less influential than long-term relationship building and consistent presence in political discussions. The seventh practical step involves using modern tools and platforms to amplify resource policy advocacy. Social media, data visualization, and online organizing can significantly increase the reach and impact of individual advocates. Create social media accounts dedicated to sharing resource economics analysis and policy information. Focus on platforms where political discussions occur frequently. Twitter for real-time political engagement, Facebook for community organizing, LinkedIn for professional networks. Develop a content calendar that regularly shares resource revenue calculations, Norway fund performance updates, and analysis of current Australian resource policy decisions. Use data visualization tools to create clear, shareable graphics that explain complex economic concepts. Engage with journalists, economists, and politicians who discuss resource policy on social media. Share relevant information and analysis in response to their posts. Build relationships that can lead to media interviews or expert commentary opportunities. Use online tools to organize local advocacy activities. Create Facebook groups or meetup events for people interested in resource policy issues. Use shared documents and calendars to coordinate political meetings, petition drives, and educational events. James found that combining online advocacy with face-to-face organizing was more effective than either approach alone. Social media provided broader reach and information sharing, while personal meetings created deeper relationships and more sustained engagement. The eighth practical step addresses the emotional sustainability of resource policy advocacy. Working to change systems that benefit powerful interests while harming the broader community can be psychologically draining. Developing emotional resilience is essential for long-term effectiveness. Acknowledge that resource policy reform is inherently difficult because it requires taking economic benefits away from companies that have enormous political influence and redistributing those benefits to the general public. The resistance will be systematic and well-funded. Build support networks with other advocates who understand the challenges and can provide encouragement during difficult periods. Resource policy advocacy can be isolating because relatively few people understand the technical issues or share the sense of urgency about reform. Celebrate small victories and incremental progress rather than waiting for comprehensive reform to feel successful. Getting one politician to publicly support resource rent tax reform or one media article explaining sovereign wealth funds represents meaningful progress toward larger goals. Maintain perspective about the timeline for policy change. Major economic reforms typically require decades of advocacy and multiple election cycles to implement. Norway's sovereign wealth fund took 30 years to reach its current size and influence. James learned that the most effective advocates were those who developed sustainable approaches to political engagement that could be maintained over many years, rather than intense activism that led to burnout after a few months. The combination of these 8 practical steps creates a comprehensive approach to addressing Australia's resource wealth failure at both individual and systemic levels. The approach recognizes that meaningful change requires both personal financial strategies and collective political action sustained over extended periods. But the most important insight James developed was that resource policy advocacy becomes personally rewarding when you understand that you're working to restore a basic principle of fairness that should govern how communities share natural wealth. The resources in Australian soil belong to all Australians, including those not yet born. Current policies violate this principle by giving away permanent wealth for temporary benefits. Restoring fair sharing of resource wealth isn't just an economic policy issue. It's a moral imperative that connects individual financial security to collective prosperity and intergenerational justice. Understanding this connection transforms resource policy advocacy from abstract political engagement to defending fundamental principles about how wealth should be distributed in a democratic society. James discovered that once you understand how resource wealth systems actually work, doing nothing feels like complicity in an ongoing theft from your own children and community. Taking action becomes not just politically important, but personally necessary for maintaining integrity and self-respect. The Norwegian model proves that alternatives exist and work better than Australia's current approach. The only question is whether enough Australians will develop the knowledge and political will needed to implement those alternatives before our resource wealth is completely exhausted. Right, you've watched 2 hours of evidence. You know what happened. You understand how Australia and Norway took identical resource discoveries and created completely different outcomes. But I can already hear the objections forming in your mind. The rationalizations. The reasons why this comparison isn't fair. Why change isn't possible. Why you shouldn't feel as angry as you do right now. Let me address them directly, one by one, because these aren't just innocent questions. They're psychological defense mechanisms that protect you from acknowledging the scale of what Australia has lost and what you personally continue to lose every single day. But Australia is different. We're bigger, more complex. We have different politics. Stop. Just stop with this exceptionalism nonsense. You know what Australia and Norway had in common in 1969? Both were developed democracies with Westminster parliamentary systems. Both had federal structures with competing state and national interests. Both had established mining industries with entrenched corporate interests. Both discovered massive offshore energy reserves within a decade of each other. Both faced identical choices about how to structure resource taxation and ownership. The difference isn't complexity, it's courage. Norway's politicians had the backbone to tell foreign oil companies, "You want our oil? Fine, but Norwegian citizens own it, and they'll be compensated accordingly." Australian politicians looked at the same situation and asked, "How can we make this easy for you?" You think Norwegian politics were simple? They had a minority government when they created Statoil in 1972. The Christian Democratic Party, the Centre Party, and the Labour Party had to negotiate across traditional political divides to establish state ownership of petroleum resources. They faced identical industry pressure, identical threats about investment flight, identical warnings about economic disaster. International oil companies spent millions on lobbying campaigns. The Confederation of Norwegian Enterprise warned that state intervention would destroy Norway's business climate. Foreign investors threatened to withdraw capital. The Norwegian parliament received the same briefing documents that Australian politicians received a decade later. McKinsey consultants, hired by international oil companies, presented identical economic models, showing why resource taxation would destroy competitiveness. The same law firms that later advised Australian governments about the impossibility of resource rent taxation gave Norwegian politicians identical advice about the dangers of state ownership. The difference is Norwegian politicians called the bluff. When Mobil Oil threatened to withdraw from the North Sea unless Norway reduced taxation and state ownership requirements, the Norwegian government said, "Fine, leave. We'll develop these resources with Statoil and whoever else wants to participate under our terms." When Phillips Petroleum demanded guaranteed minimum returns and tax exemptions, Norway said, "No. You'll pay the same taxes as every other business, plus petroleum taxes, plus accept state participation." We folded. Every single time international mining companies made identical threats about investment withdrawal, Australian politicians capitulated. When BHP demanded lower royalties for Olympic Dam expansion in 2011, South Australia agreed. When Rio Tinto warned that higher taxation would delay Pilbara developments, Western Australia backed down. When foreign LNG companies insisted that Australian taxation was already too high for Browse Basin development, the Northern Territory offered additional incentives. This isn't complexity, this is cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. Norwegian politicians understood that natural resources belong to citizens and structured their policies accordingly. Australian politicians understood that political donations and post-politics consulting jobs come from mining companies and structured their policies accordingly. You want complexity? Norway manages petroleum resources across multiple maritime zones, coordinates with the European Union on energy policy, balances environmental regulations with extraction economics, and maintains state ownership while participating in international markets. They do all of this while generating 78% government capture of petroleum revenues. Australia extracts resources from a single continent with unified federal oversight, negotiates with mining companies that desperately want access to our resources, and captures 20% of resource revenues while calling ourselves sophisticated. That's not complexity. That's systematic policy failure disguised as sophisticated economics. Australia's mining industry is different from oil. It's more complex, more capital intensive. Is it? Let me walk you through the Norwegian model applied to mining in detail, because this objection reveals fundamental misunderstanding about how resource economics actually work. The government pension fund Global doesn't just hold oil revenues. It holds stakes in mining companies, real estate, infrastructure, equities across every sector. When Norway captures 78% of petroleum revenues through combined corporate tax, petroleum tax, and direct state ownership, they're not just taxing extraction. They're building permanent wealth that generates returns across the entire economy. The Norwegian model works like this. The state maintains ownership of resources in the ground, charges companies for access to those resources, taxes the profits from extraction, and invests the proceeds in global assets that generate permanent returns. There's nothing about this model that's specific to oil versus iron ore versus coal versus gas. BHP Billiton generated $65 billion in revenue in 2023. Under current Australian taxation, we captured roughly $13 billion through corporate tax, royalties, and indirect taxes, about 20% of total revenue. Under a Norwegian-style system with proper resource rent taxation and strategic state ownership, Australia would capture approximately $42 billion from that single company. That's $29 billion more every single year from one mining company. Let me break down exactly how this would work. Norway's petroleum tax system includes a standard 22% corporate income tax, plus a 56% petroleum tax on upstream petroleum income. The effective marginal tax rate reaches 78% on petroleum profits after allowing for standard business deductions and depreciation allowances. Companies still make substantial profits, but the majority of resource rents flow to Norwegian citizens rather than foreign shareholders. Apply this to BHP's Australian operations. In 2023, BHP paid roughly $4.8 billion in Australian taxes on $65 billion in revenue. Under Norwegian-style resource taxation, BHP would pay standard corporate tax on normal business returns, plus resource rent tax on super profits from Australian resource extraction. The resource rent tax would capture the difference between normal business returns and the exceptional profits that come from accessing finite Australian resources. BHP's iron ore operations in the Pilbara generate profit margins between 40 to 60% in strong commodity cycles. That's not normal business profit. That's resource rent, exceptional returns that exist because BHP has access to some of the world's highest-grade iron ore deposits. Under proper resource taxation, Australian citizens would capture the majority of those resource rents, while BHP still receives normal business returns on their capital investment and operational expertise. Multiply that across Rio Tinto, Fortescue, Glencore, and every other multinational extracting Australian resources. Rio Tinto generated $55 billion in global revenue in 2023, with roughly 60% from Australian operations. Fortescue generated $23 billion almost entirely from Australian iron ore. Woodside generated $13 billion from Australian gas operations. Under current Australian resource taxation, we capture roughly $35 billion annually from these four companies combined. Under Norwegian-style resource rent taxation, we would capture approximately $110 billion annually from the same companies extracting the same resources from Australian territory. That's an additional $75 billion annually, just from four companies. The total Australian mining industry generates over $347 billion in annual revenue. Under proper resource taxation, Australia could capture an additional $200 to $250 billion annually without preventing any extraction, destroying any jobs, or reducing any legitimate business profits. Where would that money go? Into an Australian sovereign wealth fund that mirrors Norway's approach. The government pension fund Global generated 16.1% returns in 2023. Their 10-year average annual return is 8.6%. Applied to an additional $200 billion in annual Australian resource revenue, within 20 years Australia would have a sovereign wealth fund worth approximately $6 to $8 trillion. That's $240,000, $320,000 for every Australian citizen. compared to the current situation where Australian citizens own essentially $0 each from resource extraction. But mining companies provide jobs. If we tax them too heavily, they'll leave. Will they? Will they really? You think Rio Tinto is going to walk away from the Pilbara because Australia implements fair resource taxation? You think BHP is going to abandon Olympic Dam because Australians demand their fair share of profits from Australian resources? This is the biggest lie the mining industry has ever sold you, and it's time we examined it with actual evidence, rather than emotional manipulation. Resources don't move. Iron ore doesn't relocate to China because Australia implements higher royalties. Gas fields don't migrate to Indonesia because we demand fair compensation. Coal seams don't emigrate to Colombia because we implement resource rent taxation. The geological endowments that make Australia one of the world's largest resource exporters exist in specific locations that cannot be replicated elsewhere. BHP operates iron ore mines in the Pilbara because that's where some of the world's highest-grade hematite deposits exist. The ore body geology, transport infrastructure, and proximity to Asian steel markets create competitive advantages that exist nowhere else on Earth. BHP isn't going to abandon those advantages because Australia implements resource taxation that still allows substantial corporate profits. You know why? Because even after paying Norway's 78% resource taxation, international oil companies still make enormous profits from Norwegian operations. Equinor, Norway's state-controlled oil company, is one of the most profitable energy companies in the world with a market capitalization over $80 billion. Shell operates profitably in Norway despite paying 78% resource taxes. Total, ConocoPhillips, and Eni all maintain Norwegian operations that generate substantial returns after paying Norwegian-level resource taxation. They're not charities. They're not there for patriotic reasons. They're there because, even after paying Norwegians fairly for access to Norwegian resources, there's still massive money to be made. The resource rents are so enormous that companies can pay 78% to resource owners and still generate attractive returns for shareholders. The same principle applies to Australian mining operations. When iron ore prices hit $230 per ton in 2021, BHP's Pilbara operations were generating profit margins above 70%. Even after paying Norwegian-style resource taxation, BHP would have maintained profit margins above 25%, still attractive enough to justify continued operations and expansion investment. But let's examine the jobs argument more carefully, because it reveals how systematically Australian policy priorities have been distorted by mining industry lobbying. The entire Australian mining industry employs roughly 250,000 people directly. That includes everyone from mine site workers to head office executives to contractors and service providers. That sounds significant until you realize that Woolworths alone employs 215,000 people. The accommodation and food services industry employs 935,000 Australians. Retail trade employs 1.3 million. Healthcare employs 1.7 million. Education employs 900,000. Mining employs 1.8% of Australian workers, while generating policy discussions that dominate federal and state political agendas. We've structured our entire national economic policy around 250,000 jobs, while ignoring the economic interests of the other 13 million Australian workers who receive no direct benefit from resource extraction. And here's the critical point that mining industry advocates never mention. Norwegian-style resource taxation doesn't reduce mining employment. It increases it. Norway's petroleum sector employs roughly 200,000 people in a country with 5.4 million total population. As a percentage of workforce, Norwegian petroleum employment is actually higher than Australian mining employment. Why? Because when resource revenues flow into sovereign wealth funds rather than foreign shareholder dividends, that creates multiplier effects throughout the domestic economy. Norway's government pension fund Global owns stakes in Norwegian technology companies, Norwegian real estate, Norwegian infrastructure. Resource wealth circulates through the Norwegian economy rather than disappearing to international shareholders. Australian mining companies extract Australian resources, sell them to international customers, and distribute profits to international shareholders. The economic multiplier effects happen in London, New York, and wherever else those shareholders spend their dividends. Australia gets temporary employment during the extraction phase, then permanent loss of the underlying wealth. Under Norwegian-style resource policy, mining employment would likely increase because Australia would maintain strategic ownership stakes in resource operations invest resource revenues in domestic economic development, and build industries that process Australian resources rather than exporting raw materials. But even if mining employment decreased slightly under higher resource taxation, which economic evidence suggests it wouldn't, would that justify the current policy? Australia sacrifices $200 to $250 billion annually in resource revenues to protect 250,000 mining jobs. That's $800,000 minus $1 million per mining job in foregone public revenue. For $1 million per job, Australia could provide retraining, relocation assistance, guaranteed employment, and early retirement options to every single mining worker, while still capturing an additional $150 to $200 billion annually for the Sovereign Wealth Fund. The job protection argument is emotional blackmail that prevents rational discussion about optimal resource policy. It's too late now. Norway started in the 1970s. We missed our chance. This one makes me genuinely angry because it's the most insidious form of learned helplessness, and it prevents you from recognizing the scale of ongoing opportunity that exists right now, today, this year. Too late. Too late for what? Australia extracted $347 billion worth of resources in 2023 alone. The Australian Bureau of Statistics projects resource exports will exceed $400 billion annually through the next decade. The Department of Industry forecasts iron ore exports alone will generate over $100 billion annually through 2030. Gas exports will generate another $80 to $90 billion annually. Coal exports will generate $65 to $75 billion annually. We're projected to extract over $500 billion annually in total resource value by 2028. The Pilbara contains enough identified iron ore reserves to supply current global demand for over 40 years. The Northwest Shelf gas reserves will produce energy for another 35 to 40 years minimum. Coal seams across Queensland and New South Wales contain centuries of reserves at current extraction rates. You're telling me it's too late to capture fair value from hundreds of billions in annual resource extraction that hasn't even happened yet? That's like saying it's too late to benefit from a gold mine because someone else already extracted the first kilogram while there's still 500 tons of identified reserves in the ground. Norway's government pension fund Global didn't reach $1 trillion until 2017 to 45 years after they began systematic petroleum wealth capture. They built the world's largest sovereign wealth fund during the exact same period Australia was building shopping centers, with mining boom revenues, and congratulating ourselves on economic sophistication. Let me show you the mathematics of starting an Australian sovereign wealth fund today versus continuing with current policy. Under Norwegian-style resource taxation, Australia would capture an additional $200 to $250 billion annually, starting immediately. The government pension fund Global has generated average annual returns of 8.6% over 2 decades, applied to Australian resource revenue. Year 1, $250 billion in new revenue, $250 billion fund size. Year 5, $250 billion annual additions plus compound returns, $1.5 trillion fund size. Year 10, continued annual additions plus compound returns, $3.8 trillion fund size. Year 20, full compounding effect, $11.2 trillion fund size. That's $450,000 per Australian citizen in resource-generated wealth within 20 years of implementing starting from today, not starting from 1970, starting from 2026. Every day Australia delays implementing fair resource taxation is another day of permanent wealth loss. Every quarter we continue with the current system is another $75 to $100 billion that flows overseas instead of building long-term Australian prosperity. Every year is another $300 to $400 billion that should be working for future Australian generations, but instead pays dividends to foreign shareholders who contributed nothing to discovering, accessing, or extracting Australian resources. Norway's fund didn't become the world's largest overnight. It became the world's largest through consistent policy implementation over decades. Australia can begin that same process today and achieve comparable results within a generation. But here's what the too late narrative really conceals. It's an excuse for inaction that protects the current system, where mining companies and foreign shareholders capture resource wealth that belongs to Australian citizens. When you say it's too late, you're saying, I accept that future generations of Australians will continue receiving nothing from Australian resource extraction, while foreign shareholders continue receiving everything. James Richardson discovered this reality at age 34. That means he has 31 working years to benefit from systemic change and 40-plus years to benefit from sovereign wealth fund returns. His two daughters, aged 8 and 11, will have their entire adult lives to benefit from an Australian sovereign wealth fund that doesn't exist yet but absolutely could exist if Australian citizens demanded it. Too late? We're having this conversation because it's exactly the right time. The resources are still in the ground. The extraction will continue for decades. The choice about who captures resource wealth gets made every year through taxation policy and political decisions. Australia can choose differently, starting with the next federal election. Individual action doesn't matter. This requires government change, and governments won't change. Listen carefully, because this is where I'm going to challenge you directly, because this objection reveals the fundamental misunderstanding about how political change actually happens in democratic systems. You're absolutely right that systemic change requires government action. Resource taxation policy, sovereign wealth fund establishment, and strategic state ownership of resource assets all require legislative action and sustained political commitment across electoral cycles. Individual citizens cannot unilaterally implement Norwegian-style resource policy, but you're absolutely wrong that governments won't change. Governments change when citizens demand change, with sufficient persistence and political pressure organized around clear policy alternatives and electoral consequences. The reason Australia's resource policy hasn't changed isn't because change is impossible. It's because most Australians don't understand what they've lost, and therefore don't demand what they deserve. You now understand. You can no longer claim ignorance about the scale of wealth transfer happening right under your nose every single day. That knowledge creates responsibility. You can either use that knowledge to demand systemic change, or you can use it as ammunition for cynical inaction that protects the current system. Those are your two choices. Let me show you how individual action translates into political change, through concrete examples of policy campaigns that succeeded because individual citizens decided to engage rather than retreat. The Minerals Resource Rent Tax campaign in 2010 demonstrates exactly how individual action creates political outcomes. Mining industry executives like Marius Kloppers from BHP and Tom Albanese from Rio Tinto didn't accept the Rudd government's proposed resource taxation as inevitable. They mobilized individual corporate action into collective political pressure that killed an entire taxation policy and removed a prime minister. They didn't whine about being just one company. They organized advertising campaigns, funded economic research, coordinated lobbying efforts, and created sustained political pressure that forced policy change. Clive Palmer spent $22 million of personal wealth on anti-MRRT advertising. Andrew Forrest mobilized Fortescue shareholders and employees into a political movement that attended town hall meetings and confronted politicians directly. The mining industry understood that individual action becomes collective action when it's strategically coordinated around specific policy objectives with sustained commitment over electoral cycles. They treated resource taxation as a threat to their core interests and responded with maximum political engagement. Why can't Australian citizens do the same thing to protect our collective interests? Why can't we organize with the same strategic sophistication that mining companies demonstrate when their profits are threatened? Resource Wealth Australia exists because individual people, like James Richardson, decided their personal understanding of resource policy should translate into collective political action. The organization has 47,000 members who contribute financially, contact MPs, attend political meetings, and vote based on resource policy positions. Every member who joins increases the organization's political credibility and fundraising capacity. Every dollar donated funds research and advocacy that challenges mining industry narratives. Every letter to MPs creates political pressure that accumulates over electoral cycles. The Australia Institute has documented the revenue potential from Norwegian-style resource taxation in detail. Even conservative economists like Saul Eslake acknowledge that Australia undertaxes resource extraction compared to international benchmarks. The Productivity Commission has noted the economic inefficiencies of current resource taxation arrangements. The intellectual groundwork is laid. The policy frameworks exist. The political opportunity emerges every election cycle. What's missing isn't policy solutions. What's missing is sustained public pressure from citizens who understand the stakes and demand political action accordingly. You now understand the stakes. Your individual political engagement matters, because it combines with other individual actions to create collective political pressure that forces government response. But here's what I won't let you do. I won't let you hide behind systemic analysis to avoid personal responsibility while the current system continues transferring your resource wealth to foreign shareholders every single day. While you're advocating for long-term policy change, you can simultaneously position yourself to benefit from the resource wealth that Australia does capture through direct investment in resource companies and resource-focused exchange-traded funds. This isn't about getting rich quick or individual greed. This is about resource shadowing, ensuring your personal investment portfolio captures more resource wealth than the average Australian receives through the inadequate taxation system. If Australia captures only 20% of resource rents, while Norway captures 78%, at least ensure your personal investment portfolio captures more of that value than the average Australian receives through taxation alone. If BHP distributes massive dividends to shareholders while paying minimal taxes to Australian governments, become a BHP shareholder so you receive some of those dividends instead of subsidizing them through inadequate resource taxation. This isn't a substitute for political action, it's a complement to political action. James Richardson's investment strategy acknowledges that systemic change takes time while individual positioning can provide immediate benefit. He's building personal wealth through resource exposure while simultaneously advocating for systemic policy change that would benefit all Australians. You can walk and chew gum simultaneously. Individual action matters because collective action is composed of individual decisions to engage rather than retreat. Every Resource Wealth Australian member represents an individual decision to prioritize resource policy over political apathy. Every person who contacts their MP about sovereign wealth funds represents an individual decision to demand accountability rather than accept inevitability. Every voter who considers resource taxation policy when making electoral choices represents an individual decision to use democratic power strategically rather than waste it. Your individual engagement matters because the alternative is surrendering the political battlefield to mining companies who absolutely will not surrender their advantages voluntarily. They will fight to maintain the current system with every dollar and every connection they possess. They will fund political campaigns, hire lobbyists, finance research, and mobilize their employees and shareholders to protect their interests. The question is whether Australian citizens will fight equally hard to reclaim what belongs to them. I'm just one person. What difference can I make? You're right. You are just one person. James Richardson is just one person. Dr. Michael West is just one person. Saul S. Lake is just one person. Andrew Forrest is just one person. Gina Reinhardt is just one person. The difference is, some individual people decide to engage with the scale of these issues, and others decide to retreat into comfortable powerlessness. Some people look at a $400 billion annual wealth transfer and think, this affects me, and I should respond accordingly. Others look at the same evidence and think, this is too big for me to influence. Guess which group gets the outcomes they want? Let me tell you about Sarah McLeod from Adelaide. She's a 38-year-old physiotherapist, divorced, 2 teenage daughters, no background in economics or politics. In 2023, Sarah discovered the Norwegian comparison through a podcast interview with Dr. Michael West about resource taxation. Her first response was identical to yours. I'm just one person. What difference can I make? Sarah's second response was to calculate what Norwegian-style resource taxation would mean for public healthcare funding. As a physiotherapist in the public system, Sarah works with waiting lists that stretch for months, equipment shortages that affect patient outcomes, and staffing levels that compromise care quality. An additional $200 billion in annual government revenue would transform Australian healthcare funding overnight. That personal connection motivated Sarah to join Resource Wealth Australia, attend Adelaide branch meetings, and organize a presentation about sovereign wealth funds at her daughter's school community meeting. 8 parents who'd never considered resource policy became advocates after understanding how much additional funding it could provide for public education. Sarah then contacted her federal MP, Nick Champion, requesting a meeting about resource taxation policy. Champion's office initially offered a brief phone call. Sarah persisted, organized 12 constituents to request a town hall meeting about sovereign wealth funds, and prepared detailed briefing documents showing how Norwegian-style resource taxation would benefit the specific communities in Champion's electorate. The town hall meeting happened. Champion attended. Local media covered the event. Three constituents who'd never engaged in political advocacy became ongoing advocates for resource taxation reform. Champions' office confirmed that resource policy had become a regular topic in constituent correspondence for the first time in his political career. Sarah doesn't describe her current situation as victory. She describes it as strategic engagement with long-term objectives. She's building individual wealth through resource-focused investments, while simultaneously creating political pressure for systemic change. She's positioned to benefit from resource wealth, regardless of whether policy change happens quickly or slowly. One person, physiotherapist from Adelaide. No special expertise or political connections. Systematic individual action that created measurable political pressure and recruited additional advocates. That's how political change happens, through individual decisions to engage rather than retreat, multiplied across thousands of citizens who understand the stakes and refuse to accept the current system. But here's what changed for Sarah psychologically, and this is available to every Australian who understands these issues and chooses to respond accordingly. She no longer feels helpless when she reads about mining industry profits or foreign investment in Australian resources. She no longer experiences that sick feeling of being systematically robbed without recourse. She has both individual strategy and collective strategy. She's positioned to benefit from resource wealth, regardless of whether systemic policy change happens quickly or slowly. That psychological shift from powerlessness to strategic engagement is the difference between people who understand these issues and do nothing, versus people who understand these issues and respond accordingly. Where is James Richardson now? 3 years after his initial discovery about Norwegian versus Australian resource policy, he's built what he calls a, quote, dual-track approach to resource wealth capture that provides both immediate benefit and long-term systemic change potential. Track 1 is personal financial positioning. Track 2 is political engagement. Both tracks require sustained commitment over decades, not months. Both tracks acknowledge that resource policy operates on electoral and investment cycles that reward patience and strategic thinking over emotional responses and short-term speculation. Track 1 involves systematic investment in resource-focused assets that mirror Norway's approach at an individual scale. James opened a self-managed superannuation fund in 2024, specifically to gain direct control over resource exposure. His SMSF allocates 35% to Australian resource companies, 15% to global resource ETFs, 10% to resource infrastructure investments, and 40% to international equities that mirror the Government Pension Fund Global's diversification strategy. This isn't gambling or speculation. It's strategic positioning to capture resource returns that Australian taxation policy fails to capture for citizens collectively. When BHP pays dividends of $3.50 per share while paying minimal resource taxes to Australian governments, James receives those dividends through direct shareholding. When Rio Tinto generates 60% profit margins during iron ore price peaks while paying 20% effective tax rates to Australia, James captures some of those profits through resource ETF exposure. He tracks his resource shadow portfolio monthly against standard balanced growth superannuation options. Over 3 years, the resource focus has generated an additional $43,000 in investment returns compared to industry super funds with minimal resource exposure. That's $43,000 in resource wealth that flows to his family instead of exclusively to foreign shareholders and mining executives. The psychological impact is significant. James no longer feels like a passive victim of Australia's inadequate resource policy. He's strategically positioned to benefit from resource wealth whether or not systemic policy change occurs. If Australia eventually implements Norwegian-style taxation, his advocacy contributed to that outcome. If Australia continues with inadequate resource policy, his investment strategy captures more resource wealth than the average Australian receives through taxation. Track 2 involves structured political engagement that escalates systematically based on electoral cycles and policy opportunities. James joined Resource Wealth Australia in 2024, contributes $150 monthly to policy research and advocacy campaigns, and maintains ongoing correspondence with his federal MP Steve Irons, state MP Rita Saffioti, and relevant parliamentary committee members about resource taxation reform. During the 2025 federal election campaign, James organized 12 neighbors from his street to attend a candidate forum specifically focused on resource policy questions. He prepared detailed briefing documents showing how a Norwegian-style approach would benefit their specific Perth electorate through increased public revenue, improved infrastructure funding, and long-term economic security. The questions they asked forced candidates to articulate positions on sovereign wealth fund policy for the first time in the electorate's electoral history. Three neighbors who had never engaged in political advocacy before became ongoing advocates for resource taxation reform. Sarah Chen from 2 streets over joined Resource Wealth Australia after the forum. David Kim, a plumber who'd never considered resource policy, started researching mining industry taxation and became a vocal advocate for Norwegian-style policy among his trade union colleagues. James's individual action created multiplier effects that recruited additional advocates and increased political pressure for policy change. That's how individual action becomes collective action, through strategic engagement that demonstrates to others that informed citizens can influence political outcomes through sustained commitment. James doesn't describe his current situation as victory. He describes it as strategic engagement with long-term objectives. The personal investment strategy provides immediate benefit and financial security while building wealth that would complement rather than compete with a future Australian sovereign wealth fund. The political advocacy creates potential systemic change that would benefit his daughters' generation while building political capacity that strengthens over electoral cycles. Both approaches acknowledge the reality that resource policy change requires sustained effort over decades, not immediate gratification or quick fixes. Both approaches position James to benefit from resource wealth, regardless of whether systemic change happens quickly or slowly. But here's what changed for James psychologically, and this psychological shift is available to every Australian who understands these issues and chooses to respond accordingly. He no longer feels helpless when he reads about mining industry profits or foreign investment in Australian resources. He no longer experiences that sick feeling of being systematically robbed without recourse. He no longer accepts that Australian citizens should receive nothing from Australian resource extraction, while Norwegian citizens receive everything from Norwegian resource extraction. James has both individual strategy and collective strategy. He's positioned personally while advocating politically. He's building wealth while demanding systemic change. He's accepting current reality while working to change future reality. That strategic engagement, personal and political simultaneously, transforms the psychological experience of understanding these issues, from powerlessness to purposeful action. That psychological shift from powerlessness to strategic engagement is available to every Australian who understands these issues and chooses to respond accordingly. The knowledge creates the opportunity. The opportunity requires individual action. Individual action becomes collective action when it's sustained over electoral cycles and focused on specific policy outcomes. Sarah Chen discovered the Norwegian comparison through different circumstances, but reached similar conclusions about the necessity of dual-track response. Sarah is 42, works as a primary school teacher in Newcastle, divorced with 2 teenage sons, and inherited $85,000 when her father died in 2023. She'd never invested in anything more complex than a savings account, until she started researching what that inheritance could fund for her sons, future education, and housing deposits. Sarah's research led her to compare Australian superannuation returns with other countries' retirement systems. That comparison led her to Norway's government pension fund Global. That discovery led her to understand why Norwegian citizens effectively own $270,000 each in resource-generated wealth, while Australian citizens own essentially nothing from resource extraction, despite Australia having superior resource endowments. Sarah's response was immediate and practical. She researched self-managed superannuation fund requirements, opened an SMSF to gain direct control over investment decisions, and invested the $85,000 inheritance in resource-focused ETFs and individual mining stocks that mirror the Norwegian fund's international diversification approach, but with higher resource exposure to compensate for Australia's inadequate resource taxation. Within 18 months, her resource-focused investments generated $23,000 in additional returns compared to industry super funds with standard balanced growth allocations. That's 27% additional returns, specifically from strategic resource exposure. Sarah documented the performance difference monthly and calculated that continuing with industry super would have cost her approximately $1,800 annually in foregone resource wealth capture. But Sarah also joined Resource Wealth Australia, attends Newcastle branch meetings monthly, and organized a presentation about sovereign wealth funds at her school's Parent and Citizens Committee. She prepared materials showing how Norwegian-style resource taxation would transform public education funding, reduce class sizes, improve teacher-to-student ratios, and provide resources that are currently unavailable due to funding constraints. 12 parents who'd never considered resource policy became advocates for Norwegian-style taxation after understanding how much additional funding it could provide for public education. Two parents contacted their federal MP, Joel Fitzgibbon, about sovereign wealth fund policy. One parent, Maria Santos, joined Resource Wealth Australia and began researching resource investment options for her own superannuation. Sarah's individual action flows from identical knowledge but different personal circumstances. Teacher, not mining engineer. Newcastle, not Perth. Inheritance, not mining industry salary. But the same fundamental understanding. Australia systematically undercaptures resource wealth. Individuals can partially compensate through strategic investment positioning, and collective political action could change the underlying system. Different demographics, identical logical response. The knowledge creates the opportunity regardless of your profession, location, or initial wealth level. The response requires individual action that becomes collective action when sustained over time and focused on specific political outcomes. If you understand these issues and choose to act strategically, your first week looks like this. 7 specific actions that position you both individually and politically while building knowledge and capacity for sustained engagement over electoral and investment cycles. Day 1. Open the Australian Securities Exchange website. Research the ASX 200 Resources Index. Look at the companies, their market capitalizations, their dividend yields, their 5-year price performance, their exposure to different commodities. Understand what resource exposure means in practical investment terms. Download annual reports for BHP, Rio Tinto, and Fortescue. Read the sections on Australian operations, taxation arrangements, and dividend policies. Understand how much wealth these companies generate from Australian resources and where that wealth flows. Day 2. Research Resource Wealth Australia. Read their policy platform, their membership structure, their current campaigns, their research reports on resource taxation and sovereign wealth fund options. Understand how political advocacy translates into concrete policy pressure. Read their case studies of successful member engagement with MPs and local media. Understand that political change happens through sustained individual action that aggregates into collective pressure over electoral cycles. Day 3. Calculate your current resource exposure across all investment accounts. Check your superannuation fund's annual report and product disclosure statement to determine asset allocation percentages for resources, Australian equities, international equities, and fixed income. Check any direct share investments or managed funds. Determine how much of your total investment portfolio currently benefits from Australian resource extraction versus how much goes to foreign shareholders through inadequate taxation arrangements. Day 4. Contact your federal MP's office. Request a meeting or phone conversation about sovereign wealth fund policy and resource taxation reform. Prepare 3 specific questions about their position on Norwegian-style resource taxation, their voting record on mining industry taxation, and their policy commitments for future resource revenue management. Most MPs have never been asked serious questions about resource policy by constituents. Your engagement forces them to articulate positions and creates accountability for their policy decisions. Day 5. Research self-managed superannuation fund establishment costs and requirements. Contact superannuation specialists or financial advisors who understand SMSF administration, compliance obligations, and investment options. Understand the minimum investment threshold, typically $200,000, annual compliance costs, $3,000, $5,000, and administrative responsibilities. Determine whether SMSF resource focus makes sense for your financial situation and investment knowledge level. Day 6. Join Resource Wealth Australia as a member. Choose whatever monthly contribution fits your budget, $20, $50, $100, or more. Understand this as political insurance that creates potential systemic change benefiting your children's generation. Political advocacy requires sustained funding to compete with mining industry lobbying expenditures. Your contribution aggregates with other members, contributions to fund research, advertising, and policy development that challenges current resource policy arrangements. Day 7. Document your current financial position and resource policy knowledge as a baseline. Write down your total investment portfolio value, your current resource exposure percentage, your understanding of Norwegian versus Australian resource policy, and your commitment to both individual positioning and political engagement. In 12 months, you'll measure both individual investment returns and political progress toward resource taxation reform. Both measurements matter because both approaches work together to capture more resource wealth for Australian citizens. That's 7 days. 7 concrete actions that position you strategically, regardless of whether systemic change happens quickly or slowly. 7 decisions that acknowledge you now understand something most Australians don't understand, and you're going to respond accordingly, rather than retreating into comfortable inaction that protects the current system. Remember James Richardson's original moment of realization? Standing in his Perth mining office, reading about Norway's sovereign wealth fund reaching $1.6 trillion, discovering that Australians receive essentially nothing from resource extraction, while Norwegians receive everything. That moment of understanding that identical resource discoveries created completely different national outcomes, based purely on political choices made decades earlier by politicians who prioritized either citizen benefit or corporate benefit. That moment transformed James from passive observer to strategic actor. He realized that understanding these issues without responding strategically amounted to voluntary participation in ongoing wealth transfer away from Australian families toward foreign shareholders and mining executives. Knowledge without action equals complicity with the current system. You've had that same moment of understanding. You now know that Australia and Norway made different choices about resource wealth distribution. You know those choices continue to determine who benefits from resource extraction every single day. You know that systemic change remains possible, but requires sustained political pressure from citizens who understand what they've lost and demand what they deserve. You also know that individual investment strategy can partially compensate for a collective policy failure while you work toward systemic change. You know that resource shadowing, strategic investment positioning to capture resource wealth that inadequate taxation fails to capture, can provide immediate benefit, while political advocacy creates potential long-term systemic change. The question isn't whether you understand these issues. You understand them completely. The question is whether you will respond strategically or retreat into comfortable inaction while other people capture the resource wealth that belongs to all Australians. James Richardson chose strategic response. Sarah Chen chose strategic response. Thousands of Resource Wealth Australia members chose strategic response. Mining company executives choose strategic response to protect their interests every single day through political donations, lobbying expenditures, research funding, and sustained engagement with political processes. Your choice. Your resource wealth. Your children's economic future. Your response to discovering that Australia squandered 40 years of resource wealth by choosing immediate gratification over permanent prosperity, while Norway built the largest sovereign wealth fund in human history by making the opposite choice. That historical comparison is complete. The question now is what happens next. Whether Australia continues transferring resource wealth to foreign shareholders, or whether Australian citizens decide they deserve the same resource wealth capture that Norwegian citizens achieved through superior political choices and sustained political engagement. If this shifted something for you, if you're ready to move from understanding to action, subscribe and leave a comment telling me 2 things. What's the first resource investment you're going to research? And which MP are you going to contact about sovereign wealth fund policy first? Because individual action becomes collective action when people who understand these issues decide to respond accordingly rather than retreat into comfortable powerlessness. Norway captured their resource wealth by understanding that natural resources belong to citizens, not corporations. Australia can do exactly the same thing, starting with citizens who understand what they've lost and refuse to lose anymore.